all heard about Adam and Eve, and you may have also heard about their first two sons, Cain and Abel. Genesis 4, with these first two verses, is pretty clear about this. It is written, "Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel." Let's think about these two verses for a moment. Adam knew Eve his wife. In biblical language, to know a woman means to have sexual relations. The word knew is a euphemism for sex in the Old Testament. So Adam has relations with Eve. She conceives and gives birth to Cain. This seems straightforward and explicit. Of course, Cain later killed his brother Abel, so things didn't go very well. But when it comes to the wacky world of fringe biblical beliefs on the internet, nothing this straightforward can really be so simple. Believe it or not, some think that Adam was not Cain's father, but that Cain was fathered by the serpent in the Garden of Eden, Satan, and they use this very verse that I just read to prove this idea. You may be thinking, I didn't hear anything about Satan in that verse. Where does this idea come from? This theory is called the serpent seed theory, and it is popular among some anti-Semitic groups. There are essentially three planks to build this idea. First, it must be established that Cain's father was not Adam, but a divine being. There is a grammatical ambiguity in the Hebrew text of Genesis 4, one that is used to argue this point. Let's look at the image of the Hebrew text of Genesis 4, one with the English translation. You'll notice a little two-letter word in the red box. These two letters are Aleph and Tav, forming the Hebrew word et. This little word can be understood in two ways. First, it can be seen as a particle, what Hebrew grammarians call the accusative marker, which marks the direct object of a verb. Here the English translator understood it this way. The particle marks the direct object of two verbs, conceived and bore. It thus identifies Cain as the child who was conceived in Eve and whom she gave birth to. Cain is the direct object of these verbs. Therefore, the marker is not translated in our example. The same two-letter word appears further in the verse, in the green box. An alternative option is that this two-letter word could be a preposition, meaning with in the sense of accompanying, like she went with me, or in the sense of assistance, I accomplished this task with a computer. The interpretive question is whether the two-letter word in Genesis 4, 1 in the green box, is an object marker like the first, or this preposition. If it is a preposition, the verse would read, I have conceived and borne a man with the Lord. The word Lord is the divine name, Yahweh. A proponent of the serpent seed theory uses this alternative to separate Cain from Adam in terms of parentage. Of course, they know that Yahweh was not Satan, so the purpose of this argument is simply to suggest that Adam was not the father of Cain, because Eve conceived him with the Lord, or with the help of the Lord, a divine being. To make his father be Satan, and to move beyond this first argument, some other things are needed. There are two other planks to this theory. After planting the suggestion that Adam was not Cain's father, and that Eve could have conceived him thanks to a divine being, proponents of the serpent seed theory move to a second plank, the content of what an ancient Targum says, Targum being an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. What this Targum says in Genesis 4, 1, more specifically the Pseudo-Jonathan Targum, is this. Adam knew his wife Eve, who had conceived from Samael, the angel of the Lord. This Aramaic translation adds an interesting detail to the verse that follows. Then from Adam her husband she bore his twin sister and Abel. This ancient Targum clearly adds details not found in the underlying Hebrew Old Testament, the basis for our modern English translations. It says the father of Cain is Samael, the angel of the Lord. Of course, this translation in the Aramaic Targum has no basis in the Hebrew manuscripts of Genesis. It is purely fictional. It is made up. Beyond this, proponents of the theory add one more thought. They go to Genesis 5:3 from the same Aramaic Targum to bolster their idea. This says, when Adam had lived 130 years, he begot a son in his own likeness, after his image, and called his name Seth. For until then Eve had been childless from Adam her husband, not having conceived from him, because Cain was not of his seed, nor was his countenance like that of Adam's son. This wording denies that Cain was from Adam. Cain was not of his seed and did not resemble him. The father of Seth was Adam, who he resembled, but this was not true for Cain. Modern English translations based on the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, not the Aramaic, in Genesis 5:3, seem to convey a similar idea with different wording. And Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. Even though there is no editorial commentary that Cain did not resemble Adam, we get no information about Cain in Genesis 5:3. So there is an argument from omission. The point is that in Genesis 5:3, Seth is described as being of Adam's lineage and appearance, but in Genesis 4:1, Cain is not described this way. Remember what it says there. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. There is no reference to being in the image and likeness of Adam. This implies, according to the theory, that Cain had a different father, and that father was the serpent, Samael, according to the Targum. This brings us to the final plank upon which the serpent seed idea rests. The New Testament is now brought into the discussion to suggest that Cain was born by unnatural means. The alleged proof is found in 1 John 3:11-12, at least the first part of verse 12. It says, "For this is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain, who was of the wicked one and murdered his brother." The questioning of Cain's origin stems from the phrase, "who was of the wicked one." A proponent of the serpent seed theory takes this wording as a reference to the satanic paternity of Cain. They then take us to John 8:44, which says, "You are of your father the devil," to support that Jews also descend from Cain's lineage, because that is who Jesus was addressing in John 8:44. "You are of your father the devil." This then requires them to prove that Jesus was not Jewish, since he is rebuking the Pharisees in that verse. This is why the serpent seed theory is an idea favored by anti-Semites. Is this reconstruction that I have just laid out for you coherent? Let's think about it. Nowhere in the Hebrew text is there the slightest hint that Yahweh is Samael or Satan or anyone other than himself. Conceiving a child with the help of the Lord does not necessarily point to an alternate father other than Adam. The idea is manufactured in the Targum. The Targum simply inserts this idea into these verses and the others we read. Additionally, the Targum is confidently dated to the 7th or 8th century AD. This means the pseudo-Jonathan Targum, which is the only source for this insertion of content, is from a millennium after the very latest possible composition of Genesis. There is a 1,000-year separation. Eve is simply expressing her belief in Genesis 4:1 that she needed the power or help of Yahweh to bring forth human life. Remember, Cain is her first child. She has never had this experience before. Many other births in the Old Testament are similarly attributed to God's help as well. Sarah giving birth to Isaac, Hannah giving birth to Samuel, again with no hint of any sexual intercourse with these women, just as in Genesis 4. This is a simple expression of faith. Eve says, "I have acquired a man with the help of the Lord." She believes that God made the birth possible, that he is responsible for enabling her to give birth. She knows Adam is the father because Adam knew Eve his wife. There is no ambiguity. And taking the expression "with the help of the Lord" does not mean Eve had sexual relations with Yahweh or any other divine being. And what about 1 John 3:11-12? That seemed convincing. Let me reread it to you. "For this is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain, who was of the wicked one and murdered his brother." Not surprisingly, the serpent seed view of these verses collapses when they are not ripped out of context. Let's look at verse 10, the verse preceding this statement in 1 John 3:11-12. "In this, the children of God and the children of the devil are manifest. Whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor is he who does not love his brother." Verses 11-12. "For this is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain, who was of the wicked one and murdered his brother." Let's go to verse 15 of the same chapter, which says in more general terms, "Whoever hates his brother is a murderer, like Cain." So by the serpent seed logic, every disciple of Jesus should literally be fathered by God, and every sinner would literally have the devil as father, as well as anyone who hates anyone. The devil would literally be your father. Again, the serpent seed logic leads to these kinds of ridiculous conclusions. The contrast in 1 John 3 is between the spiritual children of God and the children of the devil. Spiritually, Cain is the archetype of those who are lost, who are not believers, who are not Christians.